Moving along, committee reports. Item A, 2020 budget presentation, high level. Mr. White.
Good evening,
Ron.
and thank you. Ian, if you could fire up the screens. Thank you. As we get started, I'd just like to take a quick second and thank a few folks that are behind the scenes, specifically the finance staff. I spent a lot of time going through all of the different programs and numbers, and it occurred to me when I was finalizing this over the weekend just how much work that they're putting into making sure that the entries that hit our accounting system are accurate. And it's reassuring when I'm going through periodically, especially taking a deep dive this time of year, that we can have confidence in the numbers because of the work that they're doing. And I just wanted to take a moment and make sure that they're recognized for that work, because I mean, I know every day that they take it very seriously, and we've got the audit results that back that up. But again, it's just reassuring that that when you go into it, into the detail, you see it and you see that it's accurate and up to date. So it's very much appreciated. And we're going to be looking at numbers tonight that are a very high level. But behind those are thousands and thousands of lines of activity and deposits and checks and all sorts of movement of financial information. So when it gets aggregated and rolled up, and knowing that it's in pretty good shape, I'm very thankful to those folks for doing that. At the same time, the department heads have spent the last month and a half working with each other and with me and the members of the finance department to get their budgets in order. Again, you're not going to see that level of detail tonight. We'll dive into that a little bit deeper next Monday. But they've spent a great deal of time going through their lines of activity, their contracts, their supplies, staffing levels, and all the like to get us to where we're at tonight. So I appreciate all of their efforts too. And I know it's not always fun and exciting, and the discussions aren't always easy, but everyone's always professional, and we're like-minded in that at the end of the day, the goal is to provide services to the township. And that's what allows us to get to an end product that most of us feel pretty good about. Finally, it's always difficult to assign finite resources to infinite requests. And we talked a little bit about that at the last meeting when we were talking about direction and how to build this budget. So what you'll see tonight is a 2020 general fund operating statement built at a baseline level. So where we're providing the township, the core services that the township provides, and then we'll take a look at a list of menu items that are outside of what the base operation looks like. We're going to take a look at the major revenue assumptions and expense assumptions so that everyone has an understanding on what we're building from. We'll talk a little bit about capital, and then we'll get into the sanitary sewer fund. I had the stormwater fund in at one point. We took that out until we get to the capital projects because that fund's a little different. It is entirely driven by what projects we ultimately approve. So there wasn't a whole lot of need to go into the detail tonight. Based on what you as a board decide to construct or install in terms of stormwater, that'll drive where that fund goes, whereas the other funds like sanitary and general fund have a lot more moving parts. And then we'll talk a little bit about the next steps. So the baseline operating statement represents today's township-only service offering at today's tax rates. So the baseline assumptions include revenues that are built on no changes in the millage rate at this time. Again, that's as these conversations progress and we get a little bit into more of the detail of the budget and what direction the board wants to go on funding different activities or programs, that may or may not change. And then for the non-tax related activity, just regular activity for the departments and the permits and the daily transactions that happen here over the counter. Again, the services that are included in the baseline assume today's level, with headcounts at the levels that were incorporated in the board-approved reorganization that occurred last fall. The capital includes the departmental fleet and capital replacement as it has in the past couple of years, but we're still short on a comprehensive funding plan that includes our infrastructure, parks, and all of those major long-term capital items. So at this point, we don't have a number in there yet. We have an estimated amount in the menu, but it's not incorporated in the baseline. And then with regard to the fire, library, and other community organizations, we've incorporated some estimated funding based on growth that we've incorporated in prior years' budgets. And those are listed on the menu items as well for the board's consideration. And at the same time, those organizations have been invited to present to the Board of Commissioners at next week's special meeting. Jumping backwards to January of 2019, where we had our first special meeting of the year to talk about some of the strains financially that the township is going to work through going forward. I just wanted to hit some of the highlights of that meeting real quick because a lot of this is still very much relevant now. That before with regard to the millage rates for the township before 2019, the last change in millage rate that we approved went back to 2012. And we were able to do that based on some pretty aggressive business tax growth. And during those years, we were able to expand our OPEB funding plan. We were able to fund capital. We were able to do some other things. However, in the last 2 years, we've seen those business taxes slow down, which is putting a greater strain on the real estate tax side of our revenue base. When it comes to the pension and OPEB, we've spent a lot of time talking about this. We've incorporated an OPEB funding plan that we're spending about $1.5 million more in 2020 than we were back in 2012 when those millage rates were set. And again, we were able to do that based on business tax revenue that we were realizing. Capital funding, the same thing. We've incorporated a pay-as-you-go program that has been up and running now for close to 10 years, and it's operating as planned. We're replacing our fleet when those vehicles are at the end of their useful life. So we're keeping the fleet moving, as well as replacing departmental capital, which includes the mowers, the leaf blowers, the smaller equipment items that the staff is using out in the field to provide those services. But we're still short then on the, as I mentioned, the infrastructure and long-term assets. And then some other things that have kind of popped up throughout this year that we've spent some time talking about, I just wanted to highlight quickly, is trash and recycling costs have increased by over $300,000 in the last 3 years. Most of that's on the recycling side. 3 years ago, we weren't paying anything for recycling, and now we're paying tens of thousands per month. At the same time, we've seen our tree management costs go up as more and more trees have had to come down. So we're spending more and more on that item as well. And then with regard to position refills, back in 2012, the police department had 9 vacancies. And then since the new collective bargaining agreement was adopted at the end of 2013, we've replaced all but one of those. And at one point, we were actually full staff, but we had a retirement this year. So again, those costs are in the police department budget, but without the revenue growth to help sustain it. Or we had been relying on business tax growth to sustain it. So what the numbers look like, 17 through 20 are up here at a very high level, about $35.5 million in revenues, and about $35.2 million in expenses. So we have a positive net revenue of about $265,000 estimated for 2020. And I'll do the laser pointer on here for Barron so the folks at home get to see it as well. And I'll go into a little bit more detail, but the revenue, again, is more normal growth. The business taxes specifically, not as aggressive as in prior years, and there's a couple different factors that get us to this 13.9. License and permits, you can see, are kind of up and down, but that all depends on the type of development we have in town. The township's had some redevelopment that has generated some significant permit fees over the last couple of years. As we do each year with the budget, we anticipate a regular type of year, as we don't want to count on those revenues, and if they don't materialize, then we're scrambling a bit. Payroll and related, we see some growth there. Again, it goes to a couple different factors. First of all, we're more fully staffed in some of the departments than we were even back in 2017. We filled some vacancies. And at the same time, and I talk about this every year, is that when we estimate payroll, we're estimating every single employee as though they're here from January 1 to December 31 on a full year. So it's a bit of a highest cost scenario. Inevitably throughout the year, there are situations where folks leave, folks retire, their savings realized, positions will go vacant for some period of time and savings are realized. So when we budget payroll, we're doing so kind of at a highest cost possible situation. And then capital debt service, those are regular, and I'll get into a little bit more detail about those. So as of now, we're at a positive net revenue. But we know that there's more there's more requests out there than we have money for. So items not included in the base, we've provided a menu of items that have come to our attention throughout the year, along with some estimates for 2020 and what those dollar amounts might be for the capital program. And I'll go into this again, but that assumes we approve every single project that's slated under 2020 for the capital plan. It's $5.3 million. Quite honestly, that's probably more than we could actually install, just logistically based on staffing. But the numbers in here and the projects in the backup detail, we'll get into more detail as we go through these future meetings. Requests are being made by police and public works for additional staffing. For police, additional patrol, as well as a new crime unit for public works, a tree crew. I have that bracketed with Township Tree Maintenance Program. You'll hear from the Shade Tree Commission on their recommendations on funding to that. That's in concert with this. Those are bracketed because it's really one or the other. I'm not sure we would do both. At the same time, Public Works is also asking for one additional staff member in each of their three major service areas, including their infrastructure, their park maintenance, and solid waste. We have some planning updates that we've spent some time in these meetings talking about with the comp plan, zoning, saldo, and stormwater ordinance rewrites. These numbers this estimate is contemplating hiring a consulting firm who would come in and shepherd the process through, and that includes all four of those. Obviously, we can take it apart and do it in bite-sized pieces a number of different ways. We have the Ready 100 consultant that has been requested. I actually have the Township Tree Maintenance in here twice. I apologize for that. I'll clean that up. And then we have a GIS/PEG program investment that we haven't spent a lot of time in these meetings talking about yet, but there's real opportunity we see in enhancing our use of the GIS software to provide more data behind decisions ranging anywhere from infrastructure with traffic, signals, or locations of parks and amenities to where population is, and really the opportunities are limitless, but it does take someone with a GIS background and someone who can, a specialist to help drive that program, as well as additional programming capability. So there's an estimate in there for that. And then, as I mentioned, with the entities that we're currently funding that are outside of the township's base service, we have the fire companies, library funding, and the other community organizations. We have what we're funding in 2019. And again, we'll hear more specifically from them next week on exact amounts for next year, but we incorporated a 2 3/4% increase for operating funds for each of those and listed it here. So obviously, the sum of these numbers is bigger than 246,000 that we're showing as a positive net revenue. So rather than administratively trying to prioritize and figure those out, we wanted to lay them out tonight, and then that will start the conversation moving forward as we head through the rest of the budget program. So to make sure that everyone understands where we're at with the major revenue and expense assumptions, some of this is refresher. We've been through this in prior years, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. The township has 3 primary buckets that we put our revenue into. We have the real estate tax, we have our Act 511, which is mostly the business taxes, and then we have all other revenue. When we talk about our real estate tax, it's obviously driven by the millage rate that the board adopts annually as part of the budget. Here is a history of where the township's millage rate has been from 2012 through current. We had one adjustment in 16 specifically to pay for the debt service on the park and trail bonds that were issued that year. And then we had the increase here for 19 that went to help with operations. And then a comparison over time with the other 2 taxing entities that Radnor properties pay on, with the school district, the county, and then the township.
So Bill, just so again, I think you said earlier that there wasn't any tax increases since 2012 or 2013.
2012 to support operations, yes.
So, but there were tax increases in 2016 and 2019. It's over 10%. So, what on 2016 it was? What was that one?
That was specifically to pay the debt service expenses on the bonds that were issued for the parks and trails. So and library. Thank you. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, parks, trails, and library.
Well, so that you mean that was the bond? That was we did 2015 and 2016 bonds.
Yeah, they were issued in 2 transactions, one at the end of 15, one early 16. But at the time the board adopted those ordinances, it also agreed to increase the taxes to pay for the debt service on those bonds.
So
that's what that increase was.
And that was only for the increase in the debt service for that.
Yes, yes.
So there was a slew of projects there. There was 30 or 40 projects in total.
Yeah, one library project and then many trail and park projects.
Right. And then in 2019, there was a 6% increase, and as I recall, that was a payment for the increases, or that was retaining the planned increases in the catch-up on the pension accrued unfunded actuarial liability.
Well, at the end of the day, what was being contemplated last year was suspending the OPEB funding plan to plug or to eliminate a funding gap in the general fund, and the board elected to adjust the millage rate to prevent that so that we could continue with the OPEB funding plan.
Right. So that's not technically an operating expense. That was remember what we had a 40-year plan to catch up on our underfunding of the pensions that were put in place for decades, and we wanted to suspend that catch-up payment, and in the end, the board voted to actually make that payment so that we stayed on schedule, but that really went into the pension. That didn't go to increase services to the township at all.
Yeah, I will agree with everything you said with the differentiation between pension and OPEB.
Did I say OPEB?
You're saying pension, it's really for the OPEB plan. If pensions.
Okay, I'm sorry, you're right.
By,
it was for OPEB, all right, it was other post-employment benefits. It's the same thing, it was a catch-up.
Yes.
It's a catch-up for
everything else.
Pensions underfunded and OPEB is underfunded.
Well, pension, we are funding at The pension's a little different in that we are funding it based on the actuarial assumptions, and the township really always has been. It fell behind based on market conditions and unrealistic assumptions, or a mismatch of funding versus reality. And I won't go into a lot of detail tonight about that, but we are funding pension, and the reason why I'm emphasizing that is there's a state law that mandates we make a minimum obligation, and we make that payment annually, and it's something that is audited. And I don't want there to be any confusion on us not making that payment, because the township has always made that payment based on its legal requirement to do so.
That's the minimum municipal obligation.
Yes.
However, we're still below what we would plan to be for that pension.
Yes, we're amortizing losses or underfunding in the pension plans as a result of actual costs to the program being greater than what was funded. The difference with OPEB is there's no regulation at the state level, no mandate to fund it at all. The township has elected to fund and try to catch up on its OPEB obligations. That's what was being contemplated a year ago. And ultimately what the board directed was continue paying the OPEB funding plan and adjusted taxes to help with that.
And again, my point is with both of those are payments going for accrued benefits for past employees, and really not something that the constituents would see as part of their return or the services provided by the township to them. That's not going to increase those.
Agreed. Diving into a little bit more detail on the Act 511, which is the broad description, it includes the business taxes that are paid. Business privilege is by far the biggest piece of this grouping. It's about 61%. Mercantile, about 11%. Then we have the real estate transfer, and then the local services. The real estate transfer is paid by on all transactions, real estate transactions in Radnor Township. The township gets a percentage. And then the local services are paid by all of the workers in Radnor Township, withheld by the companies and then remitted. Whereas the BPT and the mercantile are paid on gross activity by the businesses in Radnor. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time just because we have in other meetings. The business privilege history is we've kind of gone through the roller coaster over the last 10 years, where coming out of the recession there was significant increases year over year. It hit the high water mark at about 9 million in 2013 and plateaued, and then we've seen reductions in the last 3 years. So for 2020, we go back and forth on, do we continue this trend downward and land at about 6.5? It's certainly one way to budget, but it's at the same time, given the businesses that are here, we're not seeing a mass exodus. We're seeing actually an increase in the number of filers. So we decided to be consistent with a little bit conservative versus prior years, but in the ballpark with the estimate. And as folks that have heard this presentation before, I always qualify that with it's a bit of an unknown, just because it's a tax based on activity that happened a year ago, and we have no indicators that tell us prior to people filing and paying how it's going to do. And then on the mercantile side, those revenues have been pretty consistent over that same period of time. The only blip was in 2013 when we actually adjusted the law, changing the filing date so that in that year the township only received half of what it otherwise would have. Otherwise, that in 2013 it would have been the same too. That's been a pretty predictable revenue. The last broad categories are all other. The biggest piece of that is our license and permits at about half. Then we do have fines, interest and rentals, grants, the departmental earnings, which are based on the fees that departments earn for, or charge for specific services. And then we have a very small amount for miscellaneous receipts that come in that we wouldn't normally plan for. Major expense assumptions. Staffing levels are set at, again, at the levels that were included with the 2018 reorganization that the board approved. Wages are set at 2 3/4 for both of our bargaining units, both the civilian rate unit and the FOP. And those have been collectively bargained already and are fixed. And then for our non-union civilian folks, we budget 2 3/4, and that's an up to amount based on performance at the discretion of the township manager. Healthcare, we received our renewals from Divot, and for 2019, though, we will not see an increase in our healthcare premiums. Our MMO, the board adopted the preliminary MMO at the end of September. We're actually showing a slight decline in that expense. And then OPEB, just confirming that the $1.4 million is included in the baseline numbers that we presented. And there's a lot going on here, so this is more for your entertainment or reading pleasure when you get a hard copy or go online. But what we're showing here are the full-time headcount levels from 98 to 2020 by department. So we spent a lot of time talking about the vacancies and when they were filled and what our maximum staffing is. But at the end of the day, the township is operating. The high water mark was in the early 2000s. I think it was 2002 or 3. We're at about 165-ish full-time employees, and we're operating with 128 is the level for 2020, or 19 and 20 for that matter. When it comes to the wages, this is just a slide to show where those are at. Almost all of the wages are in the general fund. We do have a sewer crew that gets charged and paid against the sewer rent money. The expense growth here has been pretty regular based on the collectively bargained increases. The one blip in 2018 is we did have several police retirees that in the leave payouts at their retirement is what caused that little jump up. On the pension, again, we talked about this when we adopted the MMO. We've actually seen a couple years now of slight declines in this expense. For 2020, we're just a shade under $4 million, down from close to 4.2 a few years ago. And we should be receiving our actuarial update from Mock and Hop here in the next couple of weeks, depending on what those new assumptions show or what the updated actuarial numbers show. This number may change once we incorporate those into the budget. Taking a look at our debt, there are just two quick items to point out. First of all, when the board agreed to borrow the $7.3 million earlier this year, it was under the restriction that we do not increase the debt service to the general fund. So this is just confirming that from 19 to 20, the general fund debt service is basically the exact same amount as it has been. So we were able to successfully borrow the money and install those capital projects here over the next couple of years without raising the general fund expense. And then the jump you see for sewer is the jump as a result of the borrowing we did at the end of 2018 and that we refinanced earlier this year. More specifically, when you take a look at the debt service through maturity for each of our funds, you can see the increase over this 9-year period for the sewer fund is paying down that $4.5 million that we borrowed late in 18. You can also see that the general fund is pretty stable. We will have an increase later in like 2027 or 28. And interestingly, the reason for that increase is going to be the bonds that were issued for this building were wrapped around, so the greater amount of principal is later in the life of those bonds. So for at that point, this building will be 20 years old, and for the next 10 years, the last 10 years of those bonds, we will be paying the most for those during the building's life. But we'll roll with that as it comes forward. The park and open space is, we have a few years left on I think it's 2009 or 1990 park and open space bonds. Those will mature in 2026. And then we'll just have the remaining amount from the Ardrossan purchase a few years ago. And that has gone according to plan over the last couple of years. So this slide it grabs all of the general fund expenses in a little bit more detail by these expense categories. You can see by far the biggest operating expense for the township is going to be in our payroll and our liabilities and benefits, being that it's our folks that provide the services, and that's where most of our costs are at. The capital, you'll see the amounts have been pretty consistent. Again, that's only funding, for the most part, that's only funding the pay-as-you-go portion of the plan. We're still without the pay-as-you-use funding part of it. Debt's been relatively stable. And then there's been some adds and deletes in some of the specific items in the supplies and contracts, but those amounts have remained relatively stable as well. And then the bottom line, $34.5 million from 16, we're at $34.5 million for 20. Again, so the overall expense growth has remained relatively stable over that time period. Capital categories, as we've talked about many times, we categorize our capital into two broad groups. We have a pay-as-you-go and then a pay-as-you-use, and that the sum of those two numbers would be our total capital program. When we talk about our pay-as-you-go, that includes the fleet, so the moving equipment that we have with our police vehicles, our public works trucks, and all of the vehicles that move our employees around town and help them do their jobs. Then we have the departmental equipment. I touched on this earlier. That's the equipment that the staff use, and again, to help do their jobs, whether it be some police-specific computerization within the vehicles, other equipment that they have, our leaf vacuums, our leaf blowers, mowers, all of those smaller equipment items are funded in that grouping. We have our IT group, which is a growing piece of the capital budget as we rely more and more on technology and the servers and the networks and the security behind all of that. That is a growing part. We've always had the PEG group, which is the township has agreements with Comcast and Verizon where we get PEG-specific money from them as part of those franchise agreements. And that money is used for the capital equipment that helps us tape and record these meetings. I do note that the township, through agreements with Radnor Studio 21, gives that organization most of the money we receive on PEG. In fact, to the point where, short of a renewal agreement, we're having trouble coming up with the funds to replace the equipment in this room that's pushing 12 years old, and as we're experiencing right now with a couple of the cameras being out, is having trouble continuing to operate. And then finally, the facilities, which the smaller capital associated with the facilities, I highlighted that security cameras at our buildings is one area that we've invested quite a bit in over the last couple of years. But any other kind of facility type of improvements or recurbing, redoing the sidewalks, the paths around the facilities would fall under this category as well, since it's not public infrastructure, and it's something that can be funded on a short-term basis because the amounts aren't that great. When we take a look at the amount, for 2020, it's under $1.5 million, which is about where it's been the last couple of years. And it's forecasted to be in that same ballpark over the next 5 years as well. And then this graph here breaks it out amongst the different departments and divisions to give the board and the readers a sense of how that $1.4 million is being divided amongst the township departments, with, as you can see, more than 90% going to police and public works for their equipment and vehicles. Then we have our pay-as-you-use group. This includes our major infrastructure, that roads, curbs, sidewalks, signals, street lights, our parks and the associated facilities at each of those parks, which may be a playground, a comfort station, a trail, or a paved walking path, parking lots. And then we have our sanitary sewer and our stormwater, each of which have their own dedicated fee meant to pay for those capital items. When it comes to liquid fuels and our roads, we do have a $1 million a year program where the board allocates the gap from what we receive in liquid fuels, which is roughly $850,000. So we're kicking in the other $150,000 to get us to $1 million. And that $1 million goes in annually to the township's resurfacing program. And then based on the number of lane miles the township is responsible for in the township, so the non-state roads, at $1 million a year, that would allow us to cycle through all of our roads roughly every 12 to 13 years. And that's why the decision was made to shoot for $1 million to achieve that recycle period of 12 to 13 years. Where we're still looking for long-term funding plans is in these areas when it comes to the infrastructure parks. And so those will be conversations that we'll continue to have going forward. When we take a look at the capital plan, and these are projects that we presented and went into detail at our special meeting earlier this year, it's changed a little bit since then with updated numbers on a few of the projects, and a few projects have been added. But if we were to install every project that's on the list slated for 2020, we would need $5.3 million. And as you can see, in the out years, we're anywhere from 3 to 5 to 6. We have a significant trail project slated or included on the list for 2024, which causes that year to be more expensive than others. But instead of getting hung up on the numbers, really what we need to nail down here is developing strategic goals, identifying projects that align with those goals, and then from there we can prioritize and fund the projects accordingly. And I think once we nail down strategic goals, identifying the projects is going to be much more efficient and streamlined because it's going to make a lot more sense. Certain projects will rise just based on meeting those goals, and other projects maybe aren't as important depending on what those goals end up being. Sanitary sewer forecast. So switching gears away from the general fund into the sanitary sewer fund, the board met back on May 13th of 2019. We went through a lot of this information that night. I've included it again here tonight. I'm not going to go through it all again. I included it as part of this presentation as a refresher, or for those that weren't here in May, to get an idea of what the sanitary sewer fund's financial situation looks like. I'll just step through quickly. It identifies, what the revenue sources are, which is the rent, which is based on consumption times a rate that the board approves. Then we pay RHM about $4 million a year to send our sewer downstream. Then we have a crew of 3 folks, along with various sewer agreements based on where the flows go. We pay Lower Merion some to send some of the flow that way, Tredyffrin to send some flow that way. So we have various agreements that all gets lumped into the operations, and of course we have the capital, which is responsible for replacing the infrastructure. When you take the annual cost of the fund and break it in or show it in a pie chart, it would look something like this. The RHM number is pretty fixed from year to year. It does grow over time, as you would expect. Operations grows in a similar fashion as the general fund because most of this is based on payroll. There is debt associated with sewers as the township has borrowed money to install projects in the past, including the $4.5 million we borrowed at the end of 18, which is why the capital amount for 2019 is so high, as we have various projects that we're currently in various stages of installation on those. But this is an amount we'll spend down over the next year or so as those projects are installed. Really the focus is on what we do from there. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. This just helps define why the sewer fund is having the financial issues that it's had. And that's shown here in terms of the numbers. Is we've had a stretch of years where the sewer fund has been losing money or spending more than it's bringing in. In fact, in the last 3 years, the general funds had to bail it out with some significant transfers just to meet cash flow needs. For 2019, we're going to end up with a positive, on a fund total, we're going to end up with a positive net revenue. But again, most of that's tied up in the financing sources or the note proceeds that we're going to eventually spend down. So we presented back in May a cash-based forecasting model, and at that meeting it was requested by the board that we go back and we build a debt-based forecasting model. These next slides step through all that. We start with a status quo, so what the fund might need before it spends $1 in capital, based on expense growth and forecasted water usage. This suggests that some rate adjustments are going to be needed in the near term just to meet normal operating costs, again, before we spend any money on capital. So you'll see those reflected in the yellow shaded parts of that, the bar graph there. Then when we layer in capital, when we met back in May, we were contemplating roughly $4 million a year in capital. That's pretty aggressive both in terms of installing that many projects and in terms of rate. But again, just based on a pure break-even analysis, this graph here is calculating what those rates would be based on, again, these types of operating capital numbers with the water consumption. So we've taken the baseline just to meet operations, and then we layer in on top what the capital need would look like. And then some considerations, some things to take away with that forecasting model. And again, I'm not going to go into detail here. We can read it offline. And then what we circled back with to the board a few days later after that initial public meeting was what it would look like if we borrowed money. So the only difference between this and the cash model is that here we're paying debt service on borrowed funds versus generating the cash up front to pay for the projects. So there's a little bit more of a front-end savings on how much the rate would have to adjust to fund that. And again, that's what this graph is calculating purely on a break-even. So if water consumption is this, expenses are that. This is just the algebra to get to what break-even would look like. And then some considerations to keep in mind with debt, a debt-funded program. The assumptions used, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on this just because this was outside of the public meeting. We didn't have a full conversation about it, but we assumed $15 million borrowings, and then we expanded the forecast out over enough time to do that borrowing 3 times. So we'd borrow 15, spend it down, borrow 15, spend it down, borrow 15, spend it down, just to see what the rates and what the cash flow might look like over that period, in addition to what the debt load might look like over that period of time. So when we take a look at, this is the same graph, the break-even analysis, we just expanded the time period out to 2035, again, just to see how this would look. And as you would expect, every 5-6 years, there's a rate adjustment necessary as a new borrowing is done. So that's just paying down on this set of debt plus paying down on a new issuance and then paying down on another issuance. And really, as we have these discussions going forward and the considerations to think about, the biggest one for this is while there's the rate sensitivity is a little lower on the near term, what ends up happening on the back end is how much debt is the township willing to carry for the sewer program. And at 30-year maturity, with level debt service, it takes roughly 20 years to pay down half of that. So what will end up happening for the foreseeable future is every 5 years, we'll significantly increase our debt load. So it's more affordable on the operating side, but on the balance sheet side, just some things we'll have to take a look at. There's a couple other considerations that you know, obviously, we're talking about 16 years down the road, so it's tough to sit here and make real educated assumptions on what that might look like. I'm not sure borrowing $15 million every 5 years is realistic in terms of the time and the staff resources it would take to install that many projects. So this might be overly aggressive in terms of the rate at which we borrow. But those kind of things, as we get deeper into the sewer fund and policies and funding decisions, we can get into those kind of conversations. So finally, with the sewer fund, we just overlaid here the same long-term rate forecast with our debt program versus what the cash program. And as you would expect, they both kind of end up in the same place at the end of the day. The real difference is on the near term with how quickly capital is needed and how quickly projects are installed and when they're paid for. So the debt program is a little bit more smoothed over this period of time, whereas the cash has an immediate adjustment, and then it is a little bit more level. And then just some considerations to take away from this model that I just summarized. So that is real quickly a very high level brush over the sanitary sewer fund and some of the issues that it's experiencing financially. Again, I didn't go into a lot of detail tonight because we spent a few hours doing this back in May, and most of the conditions that existed in May still exist today. So there's not a whole lot to rehash. The only other item I didn't talk about here tonight that's in these slides that I want to emphasize is the need to build in some cash reserves into the sanitary sewer fund, if for nothing else, for cash flow. For example, we pay RHM in quarterly installments at $4 million a year, so each quarter is about $1 million. And that first quarter payment's due before we send the bills out annually. So there needs to be at least that much cash in the fund so that we can make the first quarter RHM payment. The last couple of years, the general fund has had to make that payment for the fund. And then hopefully we can repay the general fund, but, well, we should be able to because the capital funds are there now. And that money won't get absorbed into some emergency pipe explosion. So the next steps with the budget process. We have a special Board of Commissioner meeting scheduled for next Monday night. Township departments are going to present their programs, service offerings, and highlights and requests for 2020. We'll hear from the community organizations, the library, the fire companies, and the other organizations that the township has funded or considered funding. And then if there's time, I'm not sure, because I think that'll be a long meeting, to start moving on some of the decisions that are needed in terms of what's going to be funded at what levels. If not, next Monday we have the 10th and 24th, where we can identify specific things within a regular board agenda to address. There is a Monday on the 17th that is open and available if a special night is needed. And then ultimately, introducing the budgets ordinance on November 24th, with the final adoption then on December 12th. So again, what we talked about is the baseline for how much the township services cost today, some of the items that are requests in funding outside of that base, and then what we've built our revenue and expense assumptions on. We still have outstanding capital needs to address, and then the sanitary sewer fund is another big one. The other funds, again, are pretty straightforward. We spend what comes in, so I didn't go into any detail about, say, the shade tree. We're going to get a presentation from that group on how to use those funds. Capital fund is based entirely on what's transferred from the general fund for our program, and as I mentioned earlier, the stormwater fund is going to be a product of what we ultimately decide project-wise, what that rate and what that fund might look like for 2020 or beyond. So thank you for that 49 minutes and 16 seconds. And that's it.
All right. Thank you, Bill. That was a very good presentation. So you'll be able to get this to us, we'll have hard copy, or it'll be uploaded on the website? Will you be able to email it to us?
All the above.
Okay.
If
Great.
you want a hard copy, just let me know. We'll get one to you. Otherwise, we'll be emailing it out to the board, and we'll be uploading it to the website. We're also going to take this section of tonight's meeting and separate it out as its own separate video, and we'll have a link to that on the website as well.
Great. That's great. Thank you for, I know a lot of hard work went into this and pulling this presentation together, so, and I know there's still a lot of hard work to come, so thank you, and thank you to your staff and the team and everyone who contributed to it. I guess, you know, we do have a meeting next week. Is there any questions that anyone has once we've taken a look at this very high-level view? Anything that you want the staff or Bill to consider for next week that you might want answered that wasn't, you know, more clearly spelled out? I know we'll be delving into it a little bit more as we move forward, but is there anything else anyone needs or any questions?
We're going to talk about the stormwater. I asked a couple of weeks ago for stormwater information. I have a series of questions which I will email to you on what you sent out to me a few days ago. So we'll cover that more, I guess.
Yes.
The
and-
stormwater fund and the projects and the balances.
Yes, sir. And then, in addition to that, if I may, what came out of the special meeting we had on stormwater was the board asking the administration to go through that list and apply some priority or some ranking to it. We have that ready to go too, so we'll be getting that out later this week ahead of next Monday. Not really anticipating or not knowing how much detail we'll get into, but at least you'll have it in front of you.
I just have a quick question. I know at one point in one of our special meetings, we talked about creating some sort of structure for the community groups to come in and present, and I know that we kind of ran out of time when it came to putting that together, but have you given them any sort of direction so that they, you know, we're kind of all getting similar information from each group, you know, kind of being able to compare apples to apples, like somebody isn't not giving us something that someone else is giving us that we might need?
Well, again, we have the same, this dilemma, for lack of a better word. The organizations each offer their own unique service or offering. It's hard, and that's ultimately what we're tripping up on, is how to aggregate that into something that is consistent amongst all of them. So what you'll see here next week is a presentation and a request similar to what we did last year.
Anyone else have anything for Bill or any questions?
Well, again, with respect to that, I think, and the point has been raised several times, these 501c3 organizations that are separate entities from the township, other than the library, because I know we have Annie here, but, you know, the library is the township's library, and so I look at that differently. But where we're giving a gift to a separate 501c3, we have to look at that and whether we continue going through with that. And if we do, we need to isolate and allocate the payment to each taxpayer so that they know, and at least arguably can say that's not a tax, that is a gift that may be deductible for federal tax purposes outside of the SALT limitation.
Can we just, at the very least, can we ask each group, and I think, you know, well, the library should have this information, and actually everyone should have this information, how many township residents they serve, like what's kind of the breakdown, if they can be sure that that's included in what they bring forward, that would be helpful, I think. Anyone else? All right. Bill, thank you very much.